Hello everyone, dear viewers. World War II is one of the most tragic events in human history. Its horrors, destruction, and irreparable losses still resonate in the hearts of people around the world. Many people wonder, what if it could have been prevented? The idea of going back in time and eliminating Hitler before he became a dictator has repeatedly inspired the plots of books and blockbusters. But how would history have changed? What would the world be like without the main troublemaker of the last century? That is the question we will try to cover today. Join the discussion in the comments and share your versions. Let's start with something surprising. Hitler's path into politics wasn't obvious from the beginning, but rather the result of a series of coincidences. We won't focus on the fact that as a child he was a diligent student, sang in the choir, and even assisted the priest. Or that in his youth he was fond of art, wrote poetry, composed librettos for opera, and admired Wagner. And we will not emphasize the fact that he suffered from a severe lung disease, which could have ended his life long before the beginning of his political career. Any of these episodes could have radically changed his fate, but this is not what we are going to talk about. Let's start with the Inn River, which in 1884 almost became the scene of a tragedy. 5-year-old Adolf Hitler stumbled and fell into the icy water near the city of Passau in Germany, where his family lived at the time. He was saved by a passing 12-year-old boy who certainly couldn't even imagine that one day this child would change the world's fate. This was just the first of many events that stubbornly pulled Hitler out of deadly situations. Then there was World War I. Hitler made it from beginning to end as if fate was keeping him for something more terrible. In 1915, he was seriously wounded by a grenade, and in 1918, he was temporarily blinded after gas poisoning. Either of these events could have ended tragically, but Hitler survived. But there's more. On the battlefield in 1918, British soldier Henry Tandy encountered a wounded Hitler and was about to kill him. However, seeing him unarmed and wounded, Tandy changed his mind and had mercy on his opponent. This decision was probably one of the most fatal mistakes in human history. After the war, fate kept saving the future dictator again and again. Attempted suicide, car accidents, assassination attempts. He always came out of these situations unharmed. Even the trial where Hitler could have been sentenced to death ended with just imprisonment for him. His rise to power was also a chain of unbelievable coincidences. Some historians even blame Stalin, claiming that he forbade German communists from supporting Hitler's rivals, which may have helped the Nazis prevail. All these events beg the question, what if at least one event had turned out differently? Could the world have avoided the catastrophe? Scientists compare Adolf Hitler's path to power with an incredible accident akin to the birth of life on Earth. Each event seemed to fit together perfectly, like a jigsaw puzzle, leading up to his fateful role in history. But what if that process had been interrupted? For example, let's assume that Hitler would have actually been assassinated in Munich after one of his violent speeches. How would that have changed the world? To answer this question, let's go back to Germany in the late 1920s and early 1930s. We will see a country humiliated by defeat in World War I, torn by internal conflicts, and filled with a thirst for revenge. Perhaps the most painful wound for Germans was the ceding of territories populated with indigenous German populations, for example, to Czechoslovakia. However, we should remember that it was not only the German people who felt injustice and humiliation. In Germany and Austria at the time, all sectors of society felt aggrieved, regardless of race or gender. Riots broke out everywhere, among Slavs, Jews, and even those who were formerly considered rightful citizens. This was the perfect breeding ground for radical ideas and leaders. But what if Hitler had remained just one of many loud but unsuccessful orators? Would chaos have persisted? Or would someone else, less charismatic but no less brutal, have taken the reins of power? Could history have taken a completely different path? The second key factor is the Industrial Revolution, which continued even after Germany's defeat in World War I. Yes, the defeat set the country back, but the foundations of the future economic miracle were laid in the 1920s, long before Hitler came to power. For example, in 1927, Germany produced 22% more goods than in 1913. And it was not the merit of one leader, but the efforts of many. The Americans supported the country with loans. The Soviet Union supported it through diplomatic recognition. And Europe actively cooperated with it. When Hitler finally gained real power in 1933, Germany was no longer weak. But let's imagine that there was no Hitler in history. Who would take his place? It doesn't really matter. One important thing is certain. The Nazis wouldn't have had that much influence. Fascism and Nazism are not unique German phenomena. They have their roots in World War I and the frustration of those who shed blood on the front lines asking just one question: for the sake of what? These ideas spread throughout Europe, finding breeding grounds in different countries. One way or another, Nazism as a movement would germinate, but in a different form and with different leaders. For example, Benito Mussolini supported many of Hitler's views and came to power in Italy in 1922. But would anyone else have become as powerful and destructive as Hitler? That is the big question. Nationalists and fascists existed in one form or another in almost every country, from England and France to the USSR. But they remained on the periphery of power in most cases. Without Hitler, this is exactly what could have happened in Germany. No matter how controversial he was, Adolf had one undeniable talent: the ability to capture attention with his speeches. Without his influence, the Nazis could hardly have come to power in the early 30s. However, it doesn't mean that the war would have been canceled. As we have already discussed, Germany at the time was boiling with a sense of humiliation after the defeat in World War I. The economy was growing, the sense of national identity was increasing, and any government in power would inevitably have wanted to regain native German territories. And this brings up the question of the worst crime of the 20th century, the Holocaust. It is said that Hitler developed a personal hatred of Jews, perhaps because of suspicions that a Jewish doctor was responsible for the death of his mother. Anyway, he was the author of the most insane and inhumane genocide in history. It is important to note that none of his potential rivals or possible successors shared similar ideas. But what does this mean for the alternative version of history? It means that the millions of talented scientists, engineers, and minds killed by Nazi policies could have continued their work. The world could have become a very different place, more developed, more progressive, and perhaps less bloody. In the early 1930s, Germany was a recognized leader in world science, and Jewish scientists played a significant role in this. Experts believe that Germany was at the peak of scientific progress at the time. But how might history have unfolded if these outstanding minds had not been forced to leave their country? Edward Teller, the future creator of the hydrogen bomb, emigrated to the United States in 1935. Leo Szilard and Eugene Wigner, his colleagues, also became key players in American science, participating in writing the letter to Roosevelt that initiated the Manhattan Project. The Nazis promised a reward of 50,000 Deutschmarks for Albert Einstein's head, but he also left Germany, and his works were unfairly appropriated and attributed to Aryan scientists. Let's think about how the course of world history would have changed if these scientists had stayed in Germany. What would the world be like if nuclear technology and advances in rocket science were developed not in the United States or the Soviet Union, but in the homeland of these geniuses? It makes us take a fresh look at the price humanity pays for intolerance and persecution. Adolf Hitler, despite his cruel and destructive policies, was a patriot who genuinely loved his homeland, Germany. Just imagine If he had not been in power and had not forced hundreds of scientists to leave the country, many of those who became key figures in the Manhattan Project and the creators of nuclear weapons were German migrants who fled Nazism. If these outstanding scientists had remained in Germany, the country could have developed the atomic bomb 5 to 10 years earlier than the United States did. Industrial and scientific progress was rapid, even in spite of the repression and purges initiated by Hitler. Without these obstacles, German achievements could have been even more impressive. Even considering the fact that many scientists left, there were concerns that the Nazis could have developed nuclear weapons before the end of the war. And without Hitler, that process could have begun in the 1930s. So who could have stood up to Germany if it had offered to revise the outcome of World War I and regain lost territories? This would not only have been Hitler's wish, but also the widespread desire of the German people, who felt humiliated and insulted by the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler had realized his ambitions in 1938, and it is questionable whether his successors would not have tried to accomplish the same thing peacefully. At this stage, it is important to take into account the geopolitical situation of the time. For Britain and the United States, Joseph Stalin was no less of a threat than Hitler. If Hitler had not come to power, the focus of world claims would have centered exclusively on the Soviet Union. It is worth noting that the U.S. decision to enter World War II and declare war on Hitler was not a popular one. By killing Adolf and putting in his place a ruler who would not conduct radical purges or seek to create a world empire, the situation in Europe might have changed, but the conclusion would have been obvious. Of course, we do not elevate politics to an absolute because a strong Germany could have raised concerns in the world community anyway. In this context, the theory proposed by Stephen Fry looks quite plausible. In 1996, in his novel Making History, Stephen Fry suggested a disturbing theory. If the impulsive and racist Hitler had been replaced by a more cool-headed and rational leader, the consequences for the world could have been far more catastrophic. He claims that in the case of such a ruler, war might not have been avoided, and the scale of destruction would have been much greater. We do not fully endorse this hypothesis. After all, we are not sure that Hitler's hypothetical successor would have strived for global conflict, but it is important to realize that Hitler was not the only one who was determined to make war. In the late 1930s, the key world powers, Japan, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the United States, were also preparing for armed clashes. War was already in sight, and the conflict between the powers seemed inevitable. Hitler's role as the initiator of the bloodiest war in history is undoubtedly pivotal. However, we should remember that not only personalities create history. First of all, it is shaped by the conditions of the time. Many historical documents and investigations indicate that the USSR was also planning an attack against Germany, and Great Britain could not decide which side it would take in case of a conflict. But it is clear that without the horrific Holocaust and genocide of its own people, Germany would have entered the war much stronger. However, not only Germany but also many other nations were not satisfied with the unfair terms set at the end of World War I. Sooner or later, the strong countries would be on the way to an armed clash. We can only guess what this conflict could have been like, but we are sure that the losses would have been significantly lower. After all, as we have already mentioned, Germany could have developed nuclear weapons much earlier, and its potential opponents might no longer have been willing to enter the war. Everything else is just hypothesis based on conjecture. Also, we should not forget that history often tends to blame a single person, ignoring more complex international realities. In conclusion, we should note that even without Hitler, history could have unfolded in a similar way. The geopolitical environment, economic problems, and growing nationalism in Europe created the conditions for conflict. The role of personality is important but not decisive. the global powers would have clashed sooner or later, regardless of who was leading Germany. Look at the world around us today. Have presidents stopped solving problems by force and starting wars that kill ordinary people? No. Unless we realize that fighting for imaginary superiorities, racial, territorial, or any other, is pointless, the world is not going to get better. Unfortunately, nowadays, interest in history has greatly diminished, and there is no telling how many Hitler-like examples humanity needs to change. Thank you for watching this episode. We hope it has opened up new vistas of history for you. Subscribe to the channel to ensure you don't miss the next exciting research. We have many more interesting topics ahead that are sure to intrigue you. Share your thoughts in the comments. See you soon, friends!